Indigenous children represent more than 50% of the children within the foster care system in Canada. Yet Indigenous children only make up 7% of the national youth population. This highlights how they're overrepresented within the foster care system in Canada. Montreal does not have statistics on how many Indigenous youth are within the foster care system, but multiple reports have identified that Inuit children are being failed within the system. There have been specific failures highlighted by the media and individuals at Batshaw Youth and Family Services, a foster care center located in Westmount, Montreal. A recent episode of Local 514, released this past summer, highlighted the issues at Batshaw, not only how families and children are affected by the foster care system, but the treatment of Indigenous children specifically at Batshaw. The episode also discussed how Batshaw has closed the door on communication with the Native Women's Shelter. The Native Women's Shelter and Batshaw once had a collaboration agreement. It was signed in 2013 to improve the services that both Indigenous children and families received from Batshaw. Nakuset, the executive director of the Native Women's Shelter, said this collaboration ended when Batshaw merged with the CUs. In the recent episode, Naguset highlighted that the Native Women's Shelter has tried to continue to work and communicate with Batshaw, but that Batshaw shut her out. As a result of multiple reports in the last years highlighting mistreatment of Indigenous children and systemic racism within the employment and services, this week Naguset announced that the Native Women's Shelter is asking the Quebec Human Rights Commission to launch an inquiry into the systemic racism that exists within Batshaw's employment and services. Yesterday I spoke with Naguset about the decision to approach to the Quebec Human Rights Commission. Here's the clip. We spoke this summer as things were developing, and specifically on the foster care system within Batshaw. So could you tell me, since the last time we spoke, how has the situation developed, whether on the Native Women's Shelter side or on just more complaints and lack of response from Batshaw?
That's pretty much what has been happening, is that, you kind of get the idea. Okay, so you have to understand, I've been working with Batshaw easily the last 8 years in terms of trying to have actual agreements to improve services. And there was a time when I thought if I just, address the issues to the social worker, that there would be some kind of change. But the social workers are only allowed to do so much. At some point, it has to be upper management that makes these decisions and embraces them and creates change. So we decided, that we would, well, first we wanted to have the CIG, which is a clinical integration group. And this group there's already 2 established in Batshaw. One is on sexual assault and one is on, physical violence. And this is something that every single group and many social workers are mandated to attend because it's such an important issue. So maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I said, well, can we have one on Indigenous families because we're so overrepresented in the foster care system? And, it's sort of like you bring it out and it's sort of like, that's an idea, maybe. And then we got to there were more voices asking for the same thing. And then they asked if we could they said, well, now you have to write an application. So we wrote an application and it was dismissed. And just recently we asked again, can we get a CIG? And they said, well, if we give you one, we have to give one to the Black community. And then we have to give one to the Muslim community. And then we have to give one to we're not considered important enough, even though they have all these, kids in care. So a lot of the meetings that we would have just recently with upper management was bringing concerns to them. And what they would do is sort of turn the tables by being like, well, can you just refer us to Indigenous people who want to work here? It's like, wait, can we talk about what's on the table? Not my job to bring Indigenous people in. That's your job to recruit them. We want to know why your social workers are talking in this way to our clientele. We want to know why the social workers aren't allowing them to speak English. We want to know, Inuktitut. We want to know why. So it got to the point where we just saw that what actually the kicker was the minutes. When we would receive the minutes of our meetings, all the concerns that we brought forward were not in the minutes. Everything that Batshaw wanted was in the minutes, but all our concerns were not. I was like, wow, what's the point? Like, why do we keep coming to the table? Because it's always like, can you like write like we had a collaboration agreement that we signed in 2013. They never renewed it. It doesn't take long to renew it. It's a meeting. It's here's the paper, sign it. It takes, they just keep sort of pushing it aside. So what's unfortunate is, I was able to talk to CRAR about this issue, and they're like, well, why don't you request for the Human Rights Human Rights Commission to actually do an investigation into what's going on with systemic racism, because we had written the one step forward, two steps back, right? So it's a group of some people from the shelters, some people from different organizations like, the Rising Sun Child Care Center, different community members. We all got together and we all worked on this, and we brought it to the table as if it was an idea where we can get some information, we can collect information in a good way, and Batshaw would allow us, and then we would come up with recommendations and apply them. And this would work for youth protection, it would work for the Indigenous community. This would be great. And of course, the report is called One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, because they didn't allow us to come sit at the table. They didn't allow us to meet with the different teams. Like, everything kind of stalled. The fact that the Viens Commission, the recommendations from 2019, not one has been applied. The TRCs, that hasn't been applied, and it's not even on the radar. And the Laurent Commission, the recommendations that we put forward in the One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, they never even asked us to discuss it. What they did was they went sort of internally and trashed it, but never asked for a follow-up meeting, nothing. So all those recommendations we put forward, they're just sort of like, on a shelf with the rest of them. So what's interesting is that, we decided that we would put, this request for an inquest forward. Today, I get an email from Batshaw today asking for a meeting. I'm like, in what world do you have to like reach out to the human rights just to have some kind of acknowledgement? We wrote a letter to them in August letting them know that we're not going to be coming to the table. Not even a thank you for your email. We're concerned. Nothing. Now they want a meeting. So I think it's outrageous that this is the steps that Indigenous people have to do to try to get some kind of equity. But I mean, they have an Indigenous team, whole team that works with Indigenous, and there's no Indigenous members on it. Someone just sent me an email saying, oh, I think there's one. Okay, so this is news to me that there's one. So maybe we shouldn't have an inquest. Like, one is not enough. One is not.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Despite getting that invitation today, will the Native Women's Shelter still push forward to the Quebec Human Rights Commission?
Absolutely. And what was super awesome was I got an email from Quebec Native women, or a message saying that they are going to discuss this issue, and they are also going to pass a resolution. And that speaks volumes to have Quebec Native women backing us, because when we submitted the request, we asked that the Human Rights Commission not only reach out to the Native Women's Shelter, but to other organizations that are also having difficulty. And one of my board members yesterday, who used to run the Native Friendship Center like a very long time ago, she said, thank God you're doing this because of the thousands of children that have suffered. That was huge. That was like, wow, I didn't think about, all the kids that have, had to go through this. Because when you think of, a family, and you think of, having your children placed, all those kids, they go to different homes, like they never see their siblings. the social workers usually don't even allow them to have, like, that's not on their list of things to do, to like have visits with their siblings. Like, it breaks up families, and it breaks, it wears the parents down. It's just so destructive. And you have all these reports where they're telling you to do better, and they just ignore them. And we, I mean, I smoked a Batshaw in 2019. I was like, hey, you need some help with those Vienna Commission recommendations? We can help. No, thank you. No, thanks. No, it's good. So, I've often felt with Batshaws that, they let us into the door, but we're just standing at the door frame. So we're almost in, but we're not quite in. So they give you the illusion, oh, you were doing things. Are you? Are you
I
doing
know
things?
maybe this is a lot to unpack, but seeing as you're so willing to help, and this probably takes a lot of work off their plate, why is there so much resistance? Like, why?
But it's a systemic discrimination. And you see that I've had this experience with the police, right? Because we once did a training, right? And it almost feels like, don't tell me how to do my job. I know how to do my job. That's what it feels like. So, I mean, if you look at my past work, we did the cultural manual. So we created a manual so that anyone who was fostering or adopting an Indigenous child had like the idiot's guide to raising an Indigenous child, right? So, we did that. We even did like the Yohahio program, which was a big brother, big sister program. And even that, like, it's so funny that I don't think Batshaw realizes that when we were doing the Yohahio program, that because Batshaw had to do the volunteer screening, that as soon as the Indigenous people heard they had to go through screening through Batshaw, they're like, no, not doing it. Like, they have a horrific reputation. And that was my concern today. I'm like, if you want me to send staff over to work for you guys, what are you doing to make sure that they are going to feel respected, and that they're going to feel like you're not respecting the children? So you're going to respect the staff. And I had like a colleague and a friend that worked there. She lasted 3 months, and she just returned to her community. Like, she said she cried almost every single day. So, and my other, like, the colleague that I know that is currently at Batshaw, who's Indigenous, he went on sort of a stress leave for a while. Like, it's incredibly, I think that it's like you become accustomed to the stress level working there, which is not normal, right? So, and oftentimes, when, like, Aboriginal Day, last couple of years, they don't celebrate it. They don't acknowledge it. They have Black History Month, a whole month, but we don't get a day. And I would bring it to the table, and I would be irate. I'd be like, why? They'd be like, oh, just go. Like, stop coming to people. Like, you're too angry. Like, well, why? Why, if you have like, this is a day where the kids can be proud of who they are, that you can. Years ago, they used to have like powwows, and they used to have, I used to help them to, like, coordinate events and bring in drummers and singers. I remember bringing in Beatrice Deer. I literally still have the video footage of it, right? All of a sudden, it's not important. Well, why is it not important? Why, if you have so many Indigenous kids in care, do you not feel it's important? Why is it so hard for you to, like, coordinate? I do it in my freaking sleep. Sorry. Anyway,
Is there a certain time where you noticed the relationship started to decline, and did this kind of coincide with reports that were coming out with mistreatment of Indigenous children?
I think, yeah, I think that it's always been hard. So the beginning, I remember, like, 2007 going to Batshaw, and I had become the executive director in 2004. So I was starting to approach them to be like, as an executive director, I want to talk to your executive director, and telling them about the trends and the issues that we saw. And I remember the woman, her name was Margaret Dueck at the time. She had said to me, well, you're just one person, you're one organization. Why don't you go and find out if anyone else also believes that there's issues with youth protection and children? And that's what I did. I, like, created a little army. And I was like, okay, so look at all my friends. We all feel there's an issue. And that's how we started working with Batshaw, we used to have like a committee called the Circle of Care. And we would meet, almost every month at Batshaw, and we would talk about different, projects we can do, like the Yohahio program, like the cultural manual. We talked about having a, what do you call it? Like an actual Indigenous foster home run by an Indigenous person where children can stay, not just one. So let's say you don't have to break up a family of 5 anymore. Like, the 4 siblings can all go into the same group home run by an Indigenous person and be together, and it'll be culturally appropriate. So we started all these initiatives, and then it always stopped at Batshaw. It is always like, okay, we'll just ask for approval, and then we never hear from them again. So, what happens is when you do that time and time again, people just stop showing up to the table. And if you look at the people that wrote the 1 step forward, 2 steps back, like it's just me and Mel. Everyone else is gone. Like you get burnt out, when you get the door slammed in your face time and time again, you choose to just step away. Not me and Mel. We're like, no, we like it. We like it.
Lastly, I just wanted to ask, is there any way that the Native Women's Shelter will continue to support Indigenous children who are in Batshaw, who are...
Okay, but this is the misconception. I have a meeting tomorrow with Youth Protection. I'm going to be speaking to a group of their social workers and telling them about the services that we have. So we're talking about upper management we're not talking to anymore. We have like 3 family care workers right now. They work with Youth Protection on a daily basis with the social workers advocating. So that has not changed. We will continue to work with them. But what we're not doing is going to sit at upper level, with upper level management and say, we're concerned about this and watch it go into a void. And we're concerned about this and then bring it up the next meeting. So did you do anything about that? No, we're still what? You want us to bring you staff? Wait a minute. There's issues here that need to be addressed. You're not doing it. Why are you not doing it? Did you apply the Viens commissions? Did you apply the Viens commissions? Did you apply the Viens commissions? Like how many times do you have to say it? And they don't do it. Still haven't done it. There's supposed to be a training they were supposed to do. Still haven't done it. Like, what are you waiting for? And I don't understand why people think that we should be so patient. Like why? How many years do we have to wait for change to happen? So it's unfortunate that we have to go to the, Quebec Human Rights and ask them to, do an inquiry into the systemic racism. It does not make me happy to do it. I mean, but there's nothing else that's going to do it there, unless they have a different body that comes in and says, we've seen the reports, we've spoken to these people, what is going on? And they already had the human rights come in specifically about the Inuit children, right? That weren't allowed to speak their language and the whole thing about the education. So they just had an inquest. Now there's another one. So, I mean, wake up.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, said. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, the only thing is that, when you talk about systemic racism, and there's also Bill C-92. So I think that's also really important too, because ideally, we would just create our own, social services for our youth protection. We could, but we can't because the provincial government in Quebec won't allow it. They're fighting it. And I know Ghislaine Picard is trying to address this and fight back. But everywhere else in Canada, it's allowable, not in Quebec. So Quebec seems to think that we are not qualified to run our own social services. And then you have Batshaw that just refuses to take any kind of input and help or support. So I think that's telling.
So how are Indigenous youth being mistreated at Batshaw? In May of this year, it was reported that an Indigenous teen was forced to self-isolate for COVID-19 in a windowless basement room. Their books and cell phone had been confiscated. In 2018, sources identified that within 2 group homes run under Batshaw and the Siouxes, several youth were told not to speak Inuktitut to one another. Staff said that this was a safety issue, in order to know if they were planning to run away or cause harm. Local 514 reached out to Batshaw for an interview, but did not receive a response before the airing of this episode. Multiple reports have also highlighted recommendations for how the foster care system can be improved. Nagraseth said that she and staff at the Native Women's Shelter have pushed Batshaw to implement these recommendations. However, they have not. So what are some of these recommendations? In One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, a report co-authored by Nagraseth focused on child welfare services for Indigenous communities in Montreal. It states that employing more Indigenous staff is a necessity in order to improve the well-being of Indigenous children and reduce racism and colonial practice within the system. However, Nagraseth said that there has been a difficulty in keeping Indigenous staff around.
We at the Native Women's Shelter have
with Nagraseth, where she mentions a staff member who could not stay on board due to the systemic racism that they experienced. Batshaw currently employs only one Indigenous staff member. The Laurent report, released in early May of this year, identified the cultural gap between youth protection workers and Indigenous families. This ultimately negatively affected the families as it contributes to discrimination and overrepresentation of Indigenous children within the system. Here's what Nagraseth had to say in a former episode of Local 514 regarding how the cultural gap has affected these families.
We at the Native Women's Shelter have a worker called the family care worker, and she's had a conversation with youth protection where the social worker told her, oh, this Inuit woman, I don't believe she doesn't speak English. I think she's faking it. Or maybe if she's not faking it, she drank too much and she's just brain dead. So when an institution feels comfortable talking that way about an Inuit woman, that's a problem. And that is rampant in the foster care system. You know, a lot of the youth protection, they don't understand what SAGE is. So they go into someone's home who's smudged and say, oh, this client was smoking pot. And that shows up in the court system. Even though the social worker and the woman says, no, I'm just smudging. I'm just using SAGE. Later on, it showed up in the courts that they did a visit and they smelt of pot. So, and when I talked to, youth protection about this, they were like, well, I don't know what SAGE is, so I can understand. I'm like, well, then, educate yourself. Like, seriously, like, why is it our job to educate you? Where is your will to make the steps to know better? Why is there this, like, resistance?
So why can't Indigenous communities be in control of their own foster care systems? Federal Law C-92 allows for Indigenous communities to create their own child welfare systems. However, the Legault government has exempted this law in Quebec. The proposed investigation will not be the first investigation that Batshaw undergoes this year, as the Centre underwent an investigation by the Quebec Human Rights Commission in May of 2021. The investigation initially concerned the right for Inuit youth to speak their language, as well as the social services they receive while in residential care at Batshaw. However, the Commission soon realized into the investigation that the youth living in these facilities were deprived of a formal education. As a result, this widened the scope of the investigation to include the right of education. The investigation did not reveal a formal rule prohibiting Inuit youth from speaking their language, but that the restrictions at time imposed on the use of Inuktitut in the context of surveillance practices in the foster care centers can create a feeling of insecurity among youth in relation to the use of their language. The placement of Inuit youth in the foster care units outside their communities contribute to their cultural and social isolation. This isolation prevents the collective exercise of their linguistic and cultural rights and separates them from peers who share the same culture and language. The detrimental effects of uprooting Aboriginal children from their villages or communities are widely documented. The few opportunities allotted to Inuit youth to visit their communities while in placement worsen this problem. According to the investigation, no minimum threshold of annual visits are set by the Youth Protection Services. Youth have also limited phone contact with their families, which only accentuates their isolation. The right of Aboriginal youth to English instruction is regulated in Quebec by the Charter of French Language and Education for Cree, Inuit, and Naskapi Native persons. Inuit children can receive English instruction in their communities without an English eligibility certificate issued by the Quebec Ministry of Education. However, as soon as these youth leave Nunavik, they must initiate administrative procedures in order to be allowed to study in English, despite English being the language of instruction for a significant proportion of Inuit youth. So, the right to instruction in English does not follow the child, but is instead attached to their residence. This investigation revealed that these challenges in obtaining the required documentation that has created a chronic situation of lack of formal education for many Inuit youth placed outside their communities. The existing legal constraints also incited by the Ministry of Education to put in place a specific practice for Inuit youth, requesting exemptions for the Charter of the French language. However, this practice does not grant the right to be educated in English. And lastly, the Commission recommends that the English School Board provide Inuit youth placed under the residential care of the with educational services that respect principles for cultural safety, notably Inuktitut classes, pedagogical support services that are culturally adapted to the presence of Aboriginal teachers if possible. The Centre for Research Action on Race Relations, also known as CRAR, with Executive Director Fo Niemi, will assist the Native Women's Shelter in approaching the Quebec Human Rights Commission. Niemi cited the issues with recent investigations as it was approached from a youth protection perspective and not the perspective of the Quebec Charter of Human Rights. Here's what he had to say on this.
It's not new. It's been proven, it's been documented. But at the time that the commission, strangely enough, did not look at it from the charter perspective, it looked at it from the Youth Protection Act perspective. So this time we say, look, you got to revisit those findings that you have produced and look at it from the charter and from a systemic racism perspective.
What kind of falls out when it's from the youth protection perspective?
At the time, they were talking about young people and parents being penalized because they speak to each other in Inuktitut. They're talking about Indigenous Inuit youth not being able to access English schooling and not being given this support in order not to break up the families. But pretty much the same issue, but it depends on the kind of legal angle that one can look at it. So at the time, we look at it from the youth protection legislation angle instead of from the charter angle. From the charter angle, then you can talk about discrimination, systemic or otherwise. But from a Youth Protection Act perspective, one talks about the right to full development, the right to access health and social services without, and the violation of your cultural rights. So it's slightly different. But we believe at the time when we saw the results back in May, we found that, hey, this is a way for the commission to skirt around the issue of systemic racism. So now we want to come back to have those things revisited from the right angle. Because one cannot look at problems in service delivery without looking at a more fundamental problem of the underrepresentation of Indigenous employees. We've been told right now, apparently there's only one Indigenous employee within the whole system. And that's not normal. We're talking about 2021, we're talking right here in Montreal, we're talking about, I think, the English-speaking system. And we're supposed to be more diverse and much more inclusive. And it doesn't work that way at Batshaw, it seems. So I think those are the reasons why we believe that inquiry is not the last resort, but possibly a more effective way of bringing about change.
Yesterday, I spoke with Niemi on CRAR representing the Native Women's Shelter and approaching the Quebec Human Rights Commission and systemic racism in the foster care system. Here's the clip. So, Fo, could you tell me a little bit about how the decision to make a complaint to the Quebec Human Rights Commission started with CRAR and the Native Women's Shelter?
Well, thank you very much for the question. The Native Women's Shelter came to us a few months ago and talking about many of the problems and barriers the clients and their staff encounter with Batshaw, especially in dealing with accessing services in a non-discriminatory and a culturally safe and respectful manner. So we started to look into the situation, and we look at the study that the shelter did back in 2019 that outlined some of the major, shall we say, obstacles within the youth protection system at Batshaw. So we recognize that there are many barriers that we can consider to be systemic and that have an exclusionary effect, that have the effect of diminishing or violating the rights of children and mothers in particular, those who are from the Indigenous communities. And then we looked at why the situation happens, and we found that the lack of Indigenous representation in certain job categories, apparently it's one of the most fundamental problem, is that when there's not enough staff from certain cultural backgrounds, of course you have cultural gaps, you have cultural barriers, you have racial, shall we say, racial obstacles to overcome. And then we look at the fact that the Batshaw, like many other public services in Quebec, public agencies, Batshaw is supposed to be regulated by the mandatory employment equity law of Quebec. And then we realized and we were informed that apparently the number of Indigenous people hired either as educators, as youth workers, as youth protection delegates, as a manager is practically can be counted in one hand, with one hand over the period of years. So the underrepresentation, that in itself is a sign of systemic discrimination in employment, which leads to systemic barriers in accessing services. And that's why we believe that it's important to launch an inquiry of a systemic nature into these problems and to come up with some effective and sustainable solutions.
Thank you, Phil. I know that you already started to address this, but why is it so important to launch like a legal investigation, and what do you think that we can expect from this?
Well, when we have an inquiry of a, shall we say, of a truly enforceable powers on the part of the commission to access evidence, to access witnesses, and to look at cases, I mean, paper files, that could give the process a much more weight and much more, shall we say, necessary evidentiary information. First of all, to confirm or to measure the extent of systemic discrimination based on race, where it's located, why it's there, and what it takes to remove these barriers. And without the kind of empirical evidentiary information that only an investigation of this kind can produce, it will be very hard. It could be an ongoing discussion of an abstract or intellectual nature. And we don't want that, because the Native Women's Shelter has told us that year after year that these things have been talked about and there has been no change. So we want change. We believe that it's time for action, just like the some of the recent commissions have called for. Basically, it's a call for action. And so we believe that under the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, the Human Rights Commission has the power to initiate such an inquiry and to look at it from a systemic perspective. As you may have heard recently, there's a lot of debate about systemic racism against Indigenous peoples in healthcare and the ensuing denial on a consistent basis on part of government that systemic racism exists. But the Human Rights Commission of Quebec, even despite all the speeches, has only recently adopted comprehensive definition and position on systemic racism. So we believe that the timing is right for the Commission to put into practice its commitment to eradicating systemic racism. And this is a good area to start.
Thank you. And lastly, I guess on the point of, a good place to start, when I actually spoke to Nakuset this summer about the situation and just researching and looking into the foster care system, it kind of unfortunately seems like this is not unique to Batshaw. As systemic racism, it's kind of an issue happening all over Canada in foster care systems. I guess starting with Batshaw, do you think that this will maybe lead to holding the foster care system in entirety, accountable?
Yeah, well, we hope so. As you know, the Laurent Commission report came out in May. That's the commission that was set up by the Quebec government to reform the youth protection system. Did come up with some findings of systemic discrimination against the Indigenous communities and against the Black community and Black children and family. So certainly the reform process has been engaged. We just want to make sure that in this process, neither the government nor youth protection authorities forget, or shall we say, intentionally forget the issue of systemic discrimination, areas where there have been, on the one hand, disproportionate overrepresentation of children and families from Black and Indigenous families, and at the same time, disproportionate, underrepresentation among the staff of people from these communities. So this anomaly has to be corrected, and we believe this anomaly is a result of the systemic racism, and this is why we believe that such an inquiry is important right here in Montreal with an English-speaking institution that has been already investigated by the Human Rights Commission last spring, but from a youth protection law perspective about some of the practices that deprive Inuit children and the parents certain rights guaranteed as children and as young people. It's not new, it's been proven, it's been documented. But at the time that the commission, strangely enough, did not look at it from the charter perspective, it looked at it from the Youth Protection Act perspective. So this time we say, look, you got to revisit those findings that you have produced and look at it from the charter and from a systemic racism perspective.
What kind of falls out when it's from the youth protection perspective?
At the time, they were talking about young people and parents being penalized because they speak to each other in Inuktitut. They're talking about Indigenous Inuit youth not being able to access English schooling and not being given this support in order not to break up the families. But pretty much the same issue, but depends on the kind of legal angle that one can look at it. So at the time, we look at it from the youth protection legislation angle instead of from the charter angle. From the charter angle, then you can talk about discrimination, systemic or otherwise. But from a Youth Protection Act perspective, one talks about the right to full development, the right to access health and social services without, and the violation of your cultural rights. So it's slightly different. But we believe at the time when we saw the results back in May, we found that, hey, this is a way for the commission to skirt around the issue of systemic racism. So now we want to come back to have those things revisited from the right angle. Because one cannot look at problems in service delivery without looking at a more fundamental problem of the underrepresentation of Indigenous employees. We've been told right now, apparently there's only one Indigenous employee within the whole system. And that's not normal. We're talking about 2021, we're talking right here in Montreal, we're talking among, I think, the English-speaking system. And we're supposed to be more diverse and much more inclusive, and it doesn't work that way at Batshaw, it seems. So I think those are the reasons why we believe that inquiry is not the last resort, but possibly a more effective way of bringing about change.
That's all the time we have to keep up to date with the newest episodes. Follow Loco 514 on YouTube and follow CUTV Montreal on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. See you next time.